Welcome to the Prime Property Finance Podcast with Gareth Morgan and Mark Watts. This unique podcast will dive deep into all areas of property investing finance, going behind the scenes with property professionals, investors and clients. Between us, we have 35 plus years experience in property finance. The podcast has been launched to share knowledge, mindset requirements and experiences of successful investors and professionals. We aim to simplify many of the complicated areas of finance and investing and provide valuable and easy to implement tips. Keep an eye out for our new longer episodes every Tuesday and our shorter ones every Friday. Development is one of the most attractive areas in property investing. Bigger projects, bigger returns, bigger potential, and on paper a lot of deals look great. But what we see behind the scenes is that many development projects don't fail because they're obviously bad deals. They fail because they're too tight, too optimistic, and too reliant on everything going perfectly. In this episode, we're going to answer some frequently asked questions on how development finance works and some of the key things that crop up in conversations to help you understand development finance a little bit better. Let's jump right in. Hi Mark, hope you're well. Good to have you back. How are you?
Yeah, very good. Very good. Thank you.
Yeah, good. I'm excited to do something a little different for this episode. We've dragged out a few frequently asked questions that we have with, some that people have asked us and others that we have that come up in conversations over the last couple of months or so. So we thought we'd just kind of pull a few of these together based around development finance to try and just put them all in one place to help our listeners understand developments a little bit better. So let's just jump straight into it, is it? So a couple of simple, straightforward ones, quick fire round as it were, to begin with, and then we're going to deep dive into a couple of others. So the first one, is development finance just bridging on a bigger scale?
No, in short. Is that quick enough?
Yeah, perfect. Next.
No. So no, it's not. It's not just on a bigger scale. Development finance is very different. It helps fund the process. So we do the build and the purchase if needed. So it's fundamentally a different type of finance, albeit short term. That's probably the only thing it shares is the fact that it's short term.
And possibly the fact that a lot of them are the same lenders.
Yeah, they do share the same lenders in fairness, yeah.
Cool, thank you. Do you need to be an experienced developer?
No, not always. We can support first-time developers. It depends on the size of the project. However, it does fundamentally come down to the deal itself. If the numbers don't stack, then there's no deal. It's irrelevant because if the numbers don't work, then your experience aren't going to change your numbers.
Yeah, and then potentially if you don't have experience, the fact that you might have an experienced team around you, builder, project manager, architect, KOS, etc. So you may not have the experience, but as long as you can demonstrate a strong team around you, then the lenders would potentially support that.
Yeah, for sure.
Number 3, what matters more, the deal or the borrower?
Okay, interesting one. They both matter, but I suppose what I alluded to just now is that ultimately if the numbers don't stack up, then you can't really take it forward much, irrespective of the experience of the person who's got the deal. Yeah, so there's that one.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't fund a bad deal, can you, at the end of the day?
Yeah, definitely.
Is development finance expensive?
Expensive compared to what is the question. So if you're comparing it to a mortgage, then you're going to find it expensive. Do you want to be comparing development finance versus development finance? So there are scales in cost of funds. Ultimately, though, the question is, does it fit into your deal in the first instance? So is there enough margin to absorb the costs that exist? Because invariably development has slightly bigger profits or will have bigger profits and so on. So it's what does it unlock as opposed to how expensive is it?
Yeah, how much profit can you make from a deal? And is it worth paying that development finance cost in order to get that profit out the back end? So absolutely. Cool. And then the last one, number 5, what is the biggest misconception about development?
That's a good question. Based on all the spreadsheets I've seen, is every deal is perfect on paper, very different in reality. when you've got cost overruns, the weather's terrible, so you can't actually build, and so on and so forth. So everything seems to work on paper, not everything works in reality.
Yeah, brilliant. Spot on. Cool. Okay, so that's where the quick ones end, and we're going to jump into a couple of different questions now and go a little bit deeper on these ones. So the first one is, what actually makes a development deal stack?
Ooh, proper deep dive. Okay, so made a few points on this. There's loads of things. So we can talk about this for a long time because it's very relevant to what is your objective, what you're trying to achieve, etc., etc. But if we just go back to the fundamentals as to the aim is you're trying to make money for a start and you want to get it funded. So a couple of things then to talk about are going to be the profit on cost. Okay, so that is how much, based on project costs, how much you make it as a percentage of. You want to be aiming around 20%, if not higher. And when you run your numbers, when it's 20%, you'll see that the finance fits into that sensibly as well. The finance will sit in the costs of that as well, that figure. So bear that in mind. Something else to bear in mind is the build costs. The amount of people we speak to, developers we speak to who are doing their own work, will price it on the basis it's them doing the work, which is great. And that is what you'll pay on day one. However, the lenders don't necessarily see it that way. And we'll speak about that in a bit more later on. So making sure you've got realistic build costs. Also making sure you've got realistic timescales. You're not going to build 20 more flats in 3 months in reality. So again, because it's not just how much you need to borrow, it's the length of time you need to borrow it over, because it's the interest accrued over time. That is a big thing. So people often miss the time factor. Perhaps a little too optimistic. We live in the UK, it rains a lot, and that can severely hamper your ability to do certain developments. GDV, end value assumptions, don't over-egg it. Is try and be conservative where you can. The amount of people who tell me these are really conservative numbers and then say numbers that are not really conservative because the deal works on those numbers. So it's really easy to build your project and then go, if it's worth 320,000 or 3.2 million or whatever, I'm going to make this much money. And it's quite easy to fall into that trap. So just make sure your assumptions are right. And also make sure you are using the right valuation methodology when it comes to the GDV assumption on that front. Contingency is another to think about. If you added a proper contingency in there, is it still a deal? The amount of people, again, or deals that we've seen where it's been a few percent, lenders run anything between 5 and 15, dependent really on the project or the lender. And once you put in a 10% contingency, all of a sudden the numbers break and it's no longer profitable, then it's not a deal again. So there's things there. And then lastly, then just making sure you can sensitize the deal. So if any of those numbers change, then does it still work? Or what level of change can you tolerate is probably the best way to describe that.
Yeah. And Martin Rapley, we did a podcast with him a little while back around costing of refurbs and developments and things. And he made a really good point around contingency. Contingency is for things that you were not expecting and should not form part of your build cost, where something that you've missed, that you've not, or you've mispriced, which is just a different view on it. And I think one that's important, people go, well, I'll reduce the cost of my refurb, but I'll put a contingency in which case, well, that should have been in your refurb cost in the first place. That's not what the contingency's for. Contingency's for when you uncover something that you were not aware of as you were entering the deal, such as bad weather or finding dry rot or subsidence or something, needing to take, the property back to brick or whatever it may be. That's a contingency and not form part of your refurb cost. So that was just something worth going to listen back to if you haven't listened to that one already.
Yeah, and look, and this goes back to what I said on the quickfire ones. I joke about every spreadsheet's perfect, and what you tend to find. What I've seen a lot of is the end value is fixed. Invariably, it's fixed. There is a figure, and you can't really affect that much, depending on what the scheme is and what you're building and so on. The market dictates what that figure is. and you try and reverse engineer it, and then you will cut things like you'll reduce your build cost, or actually I'm doing this so my labor isn't, and then you'll strip that out, or you'll reduce that, let's say that contingency, just to make the parameters set so that you're getting that 20%. Whereas, if you were objectively looking at it, because this is an emotional thing as well, because you get drawn into your own deal, if you're objectively looking at it and saying, well, you should really put them back in, the deal starts to get quite weak, and then you're going, well, and that's probably the way you should look at it, is just try and be as impartial as you can.
For me, it's about on this, the one key thing that I would like to share with people is around the actual build cost. And I know you've touched on that, but the amount of developers, builders that I'm speaking to that are just can't believe the way the costs are running these days. And it seems to be changing every 6 months. It is really, and obviously we're entering another period of potential increase in costs now because of oil prices with the conflict in the Middle East. How's that now already going to put more prices up? I know I heard on the weekend that one supplier is just putting their prices up by 15% overnight.
Just because?
Why? Because, yeah. And, they may go up overnight, but how quickly are they going to come back down? And are they going to come back down? And so, yeah, it's and that's just one supplier. So, move that across the industry overnight, 15% increase on your costs. It's crazy. It's crazy. So, yeah, absolutely keep an eye on those costs.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. And this is where sensitivity comes into play, right? So, whilst you probably would not be sensitizing for just a 15% uplift in cost just because of a conflict in the Middle East. You should really be sensitizing your cost to a point. As I say, the way that I would best describe it is, rather than say, I'm going to test this with a 10% contingency, that's not the point. The point is test it until it breaks to know what level of tolerance exists in the project. The more percentages or the more figures you can add to your original assumptions, the more stress it has in it, and the more it can ride out things like a 15% increase in build cost just because, or labour force, changing contractor because they just walked off the job or they went bust or something like that. So that's what we're looking for. The further away or the more profit there is, the more chance there is of you actually getting to profit at the end of the project.
And the other thing as well that people need to consider is, you have different types of people that will look at these things. You might have somebody that will come to you with a deal that's got 10% profit on cost, but they've been so conservative with every single number that the likelihood is that they will get their 10% profit on cost, in which case it's a good deal because they've just gone over the top on everything. Whereas you might find someone has gone 20% profit on cost, but has gone the other end on all of their costs and will potentially come back down and be in a worse position than the first person. So there is an opportunity here to procrastinate on the numbers a little bit and then therefore not do a deal. So it's just getting that balance right and being confident enough with your numbers that a deal can be done. But the higher you start with the profit on cost, the more wriggle room you've got if things do go wrong, I guess.
Yeah, no, I see what you're saying. And also I think some of the best ones that I've seen are very, very good at value engineering. So what I mean by that is maximizing what you can do with that particular property. So let's take an old Victorian 3-story property. The default answer will be, 3 flats, 1 bed, etc., or what have you. Somebody else who's experienced of that may look at it differently and go, well, actually, no, it's worth more as a 7-bed HMO than it is split into 3 individual flats or whatever it may be. So making sure you're doing the right thing with the right property is value engineering in itself, and making sure that you can squeeze all of the profit out of it to make that. So that's where a deal will look very different to one person on a property versus the next. They'll just see different opportunities from that. But as I say, that value engineering thing, there are some people out there who are just fantastic at it, can just look at it and very quickly go, don't do it that way, do it this way instead.
Absolutely. And that comes with experience and getting advice from the right people who can help you with that process. It doesn't have to be you that comes up with that. That can be a developer, a builder, an architect, etc., isn't it?
Yeah.
So
yeah, definitely.
Cool. Awesome. Okay, let's move on to question 2 then, which is, how do lenders assess the exit and what kills deals?
Okay, interesting. So we harp on a lot about exit. So getting the finance to build it is one thing. Paying off the finance is something entirely different. And I guess there's a bit here around what's the objective? Are you keeping it? Or are you refinancing it and then retain it? Are you keeping it? Are you refinancing it? Or are you selling it? Which are two different things. And the reason for that is, why are they two different things? Well, if you refinance, you have to leave a percentage of equity in it, typically on a buy-to-let, 25% equity. So you can't unlock the top 25% because it's tied in through mortgage. Whereas if you sell it, you realize 100% of the value of the asset. Okay, so we often see developers who intended on keeping it, project hasn't quite gone as planned, and now have to sell it because you can't raise enough on the refinance to cover the original finance that was taken. Now, these are normally scenarios where you may have taken longer than expected, or the cost of works have gone up considerably over through the project time. So those are the two differentiations. So when you're looking at your exit, refinance, so lenders will often give you a discount if you want to refinance. Okay, and the reason being is because they know if it works on a refinance, you've got the 25% headroom that you can sell it, so it de-risks the proposition somewhat. So that's the key consideration before you move on to anything else. We touched upon it in the last question, but your GDV, making sure that that is actually a robust GDV end value. I mentioned around the methodology piece. So let's take a HMO, for example. This is classic for a development project for a HMO. We'll get a project in, the GDV, let's say, is 500,000. And then you look further down the spreadsheet and you'll see that the 500,000 is a 10% yield based on 50K a year coming in gross rent. Yeah. Developer finance lenders won't look at it like that. They will look at it on a vacant possession basis, which is a different methodology. So whilst you can refinance at the HMO commercial value, and that number is relevant, the vacant possession may be 420, 430, let's say. That's the number we're basing the deal on. So is your GDV assumption correct, and is the right methodology being used? That's a 70 grand hole in the numbers, potentially. And you don't want to pay 3 grand to get a valuation report to figure that out. It's a waste of time and money for all concerned, usually.
There's enough information out there, isn't it, to be able to get that information?
Exactly. The other thing that, again, speaks to what you were talking about around the build costs and what have you, development finance lenders see a lot of deals and are in this space 100% of the time. They know what's going on in the market. They know whether your numbers are sensible around build costs. Yes, they will lean on valuers and surveyors and QSs and whatnot to ratify the numbers. But they have got deals midway through its project where people are coming back and running out of money because build costs have gone up by 15%. So they will have a forward-looking view on that. And hence, when they challenge you on your build costs, for example, they will be challenging you for a very good reason, because it's not, you saying I'm going to get it done for 40 grand, whereas everyone else has done it for 80. You're going to get challenged on those numbers. So just bear that in mind as well. So market's moving on that front.
I think for me, just touching on the sale aspect. So a lot of developers want to, they don't want to own property, so they don't want to refinance. They want to flip properties. And some of the considerations from a lender's perspective are, whilst you might have planning for 30 flats in this location, I know you talk about this a lot, can the market tolerate 30 flats entering the market? Is there actually demand for those to be sold in the open market? And that, if that's the case, if maybe it can, but if it can't, what's the time frame that it may take to get 30 flats sold? And so the lenders will take that, that's a risk for them from an exit perspective. They may lend you a little bit more if you're going to sell because you're not looking to refinance. However, they just got to make their sense check. And, if you're building 10 executive homes on the edge of a council estate, for instance, just the reality is, how quickly are you going to shift those 10 executive homes? Is there demand for it? The market, is there a strong demand for that type of property? So whilst you may have planning for it, and that doesn't suggest that there's a market for it, which are two very different things. And that's sometimes the things that people can overlook.
Yeah, definitely. And not just demand for the property, but demand of the property at the values you are quoting. So I'm sure somebody will buy an executive home for 60k, but it clearly doesn't work financially on that basis. So, flooding the market with the wrong product. I've got an example actually where they are building, I think it's 21 apartments or something of that nature. One of my clients is trying to buy one, but it's exclusively social housing. Supported living, I should say. Issues can't get a mortgage on it because if that company fails and so on, the supply of demand, and it's restricted to supported living and all of that. So it just becomes quite complex, and that's acting for the buyer in this particular scenario, not the actual developer. So what's the mortgageability of the property for somebody to come in and buy? Otherwise, you're only now selling to cash buyers. So these are all things that have to be considered. If you go in as particularly niche, then you are, by nature of being niche, restricting your lender base.
Yeah, absolutely. And from a developer's perspective, most people focus on getting the loan, whereas the lender's focus is on how they get repaid. And they want some certainty that they're going to get their money back, right?
Absolutely. And I've seen schemes that have been stuck where, they're sitting on 2-3 properties. They want to hold out for the right prices. Well, they have to hold out for the right prices because otherwise the numbers cease to make sense. And therefore, the funds start drying up. They come looking for secondary sources of funding to keep the project going. And then, when you've got a second source of funding, that's invariably more expensive than the first source. And these things just really start to mount up then as to how these things can go wrong.
Cool. Okay. And then if we just move on to the final one then, which is what actually goes wrong and what can you do to protect against it?
Ooh, it's a long list.
Yeah. And I guess we probably covered off a fair bit of those in the first two answers, but there's probably a couple that jump out.
Yeah, so we've got delays, time. So a plethora of reasons why things might get delayed, but time as part of this equation is something that gets overlooked. As I say, the longer you've got the money, irrespective of your interest rate, the longer you've got it, the more interest you're going to pay. So that's something to bear in mind on that front. Cost overruns, as mentioned. So just you've budgeted X and it's not sufficient for whatever reason. Cost of supplies may have gone up. Labor costs may have gone up. Various different reasons as to why that may happen. Contractor issues, I said about, possibly them going bust. And, these aren't unusual. I've heard horror stories where builders have walked off site because of disputes over works and so on and so forth, leaving people in the lurch, completely in the lurch, and having to find a new contractor. A new contractor invariably doesn't want to come in and pick up an old contractor's work because they don't know what's gone into it, especially if you're building houses. That could be a right nightmare. On that front, planning, so again, I've seen projects where pre-commencement conditions have just taken an age to get signed off. So yeah, I've got my planning ready to go, happy days, but I've ticked all the boxes in order so that you can actually start developing. And I've seen people stuck in pre-commencement issues for 6 months when they've only got the loan for 12, and they were meant to be in and out of it within 7 or 8. So those are the things to bear in mind as well on that front. And then, just gaps in finance. This can naturally lead to, so the primary lender, whoever's giving you the loan in the first instance, will have an appetite. Now, they will probably allow you to go, if something goes wrong, they'll probably support you. But that support has a limit. There is a certain point where they cannot continue the support. So you may have to go to a secondary lender. And as I said in the last question, is that can start to get exceptionally expensive. Mezzanine finance, which is another form of finance, starts in the teens in terms of interest rate per annum. So you can see how that can really distort a deal going forward.
Yeah, I think the other one is probably one that you've missed is probably just changes in the market. I mean, if when you start the project, like you say, use an example of 10 executive homes, and, the demand is there when you look at the project and you start, getting planning or looking at the property, and that might have been 2 years ago. Things happen, things change, cost of living crisis, various things going on, inflation, etc. And then all of a sudden, people are starting to, jobs are being cut and things like that. Next minute, the top end of the market is probably the part that slows down first. And all of a sudden, it's a bit more difficult. I know there was, in Wales, for instance, we have an example, in West Wales, the local authorities were fed up with, so it's beautiful parts of West Wales along the coast, and there was a lot of wealthy English people. Some areas are called Little England and things, where a lot of wealthy English people would have second homes or holiday homes in the location, and the council were fed up with these villages being very busy in the summer, but basically nobody there in the winter, and they've basically changed the rules on council tax on second homes to 300%. And they were doing, they were implementing some other changes and things. And so all of a sudden, it just pretty much overnight changed the demand for those homes in those second locations. So if you're a developer in that location, building nice homes because you're pretty sure that you'll get an exit on them, the market just changes. All of a sudden, you're left with these properties that are difficult to shift. And that means, carrying additional costs that you wouldn't have foreseen. So those are the types of things that are outside of your control, but it's being able to then go, well, what can we do to avoid that? And you're trying to scenario plan A, B, C, D, E, F, and as far as you can go, really.
And what we tend to see, again, I'm just speaking from experience of the deals that come into us, is, a lot of these, especially new builds, are tailored towards sort of a middle tier, really. And when you go into difficult scenarios with recession and, challenging financial cost of living going up and what have you, I always use the same example. So there were 3 sports shops were back in the day, and they were, you still got JD Sports, who are there now, who are, the expensive sports shop, if you like. You've got Sports Direct, who are the budget level of that. And used to have a firm called JJB Sports, which sat bang in the middle of everything. And the minute we went into recession, the people who had money continued to shop in the expensive shop. Those that were in the middle, who had their income squeezed, defaulted down to the budget option, went into Slazenger and everything, and Dunlop and whatnot. And then JGB ultimately went bust because nobody was shopping in the middle band anymore. And that's probably a good example as to every time it happens that we have a compression in the market, it's usually that middle tier that either goes up or down. The wealthy stay wealthy, and the middle class tend to go downwards because their budgets are being squeezed. So that middle tier is always the one that comes under pressure. So, those are probably the properties to keep an eye out for when you're looking for development opportunities in recession, is because people will probably vacate those, and those are the ones you'll probably see on the market. So that's what we tend to see when the market shifts as a general concept.
Awesome. Okay, well, cool. I think we've covered off, at a high level, some of those questions and that are frequently asked, and hopefully there's been a lot of value shared. Is there anything you'd like to sort of wrap up with, any of that?
No, I think in regards to this, we see some fantastic deals. We're only obviously talking about the ones that are sitting on the margins, or the ones that just don't work. Clearly, there's a lot of deals that do work. There's a lot of good developers, and we see, whilst I joke about spreadsheets, we see some great analytics going on in there as well. So don't be put off by it. We're obviously here to highlight the risks that sit with it. But if it's a good deal, you'll make it work. Obviously, the ones that we are talking about, the ones where they are actually fundamentally not a good deal in the first place. So just bear that in mind. This, we're not here to be negative. That we see plenty of great deals, and I'm sure if this one isn't one that's working, don't force the issue, I guess, is the message. Just go out and find a better deal. It might take you another 18 months, but keep the hunt, be persistent, and eventually you will get to the objective you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, awesome. And I think just to kind of recap on the points of, everything we've talked about is, a good development deal will have margin built into it so that it is wiggle room in there, using conservative numbers, having an experienced and well-supported team around you, a real crystal clear exit strategy, and as an exit A, B, C, and D, and probably as far as you can go, and then just making sure all your finances structured properly from day one. And good developers don't rely on perfect outcomes. They plan for imperfect outcomes. And so just how you deal with these things as you come along is the important piece. Awesome. Thanks for your time, Mark. see you on the next episode.
Yeah, thank you very much. Take care.
So development finance isn't about how quickly you can build. It's about how well your deal holds up when things don't go to plan. The investors who succeed in this space aren't the ones chasing the biggest projects. They're the ones structuring the safest deals and ensuring profitability. If you're looking at development and want to sense check numbers, the exit, or the finance structure, it's worth having a conversation early, because small assumptions at the start can become big problems later on. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode. Thank you so much for listening to our podcast. We hope you have learned something and have some tips to take away. We'd be very grateful if you enjoyed the show. You could give us a review and share with anyone that you know that may be interested, and of course subscribe to the show so you can get notified when a new episode is released. If you'd like us to answer any questions or go deeper on a specific topic, please drop us a message at primeproperty.finance. See you on the next episode.